make sure you recognize the fact that the turbine shaft goes here, right? The turbine shaft, the little shaft that comes out the front. If a transmission is built the right way, remember this when you put that one back together, you ought to be able to grab that turbine shaft with your hand and turn it. If it's locked up and it won't move, then you're going to go back in there. This one here, something else that happens, these splines get stripped. You can totally miss that. It won't show up on the turbine shaft. The turbine shaft is harder than this thing, typically. If it wipes this out, where does all of that metal go? It goes from, where does the oil go when it leaves the torque converter? Where's the first place it goes? Nope. It goes to the cooler. Because where's the heat in an automatic transmission created? In the torque converter. Because it's shearing this oil, right? Now, you ever see somebody stand out there and sit out there in traffic, in a traffic jam on a hot day for a long time with a car in drive, and all of a sudden it starts puking transmission fluid out? Why would it do that? Well, because it's shearing the fluid, and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter because they're in drive. And the hotter it gets, the more it starts to boil the fluid starts to expand more and more. The next thing you know, it's puking out the vent and going all over the road. And they said, oh no, I've developed a transmission leak. Well, basically they're cooking the fluid. When the fluid starts to get hot, and like if you're pulling something a long way, like a heavy load a long way, and it's having to shear the fluid a lot, that fluid starts to change properties. And it starts to plant varnish all over everything. And it starts to get stinky and smelly. And it starts to cause valves to stick. And there's just all kinds of stuff that goes crazy. So if you've ever had to hook up to something you're not used to pulling with your automatic transmission, and you're either going to, if you're pulling a little bit too heavy of a load, you know, if you just, there's a lot of pressure right here, it can shear that out. It's going to change the properties of the fluid. My son drove a 86 model Ford LTD that I bought, and I bought it originally from these people down in Clayhatchee. That the guy worked at a parts store, and he had changed about $500 or $600 worth of parts on it trying to get it to run right. And so he brought it to me, and what I did was I troubleshot it, and I found out the torque or the catalytic converter was stopped up. So I took care of that problem, and then I gave it to my son to drive for a while. And as he drove it down the road, all of a sudden, it would start pushing transmission fluid out the vent. And there would be a mist of transmission fluid coming out behind him going down the road. So what do you think's going on with that? Now, the transmission had a modulator valve on it. I will tell you this. Now, who knows what a modulator valve is and who does not? You know what a modulator valve is? Raise your hand if you don't know what a modulator valve is. Okay, when you're into the throttle and you're going up a hill, you want it to hold the gears longer, do you not? If you're driving a stick and you're going up a long hill, you're going to put it in that lower gear and you're going to keep it in that lower gear for a long time, right? You want the automatic transmission to do the same thing. In the olden days, everybody except Chrysler that I know about used a modulator valve. And a modulator valve was a little diaphragm, and that Oldsmobile's got one on it, and that Bronco's got one on it. It's on the side of the transmission, and it's got a vacuum line going straight to manifold vacuum. What happens, what does it mean when your manifold vacuum is low? When you're in a driving situation and you've got low manifold vacuum, what does that mean? It means you're deep into the throttle. When you're deep into the throttle, vacuum's low, that means high load, right? If you were to take that Bronco in there, or that Oldsmobile, and take the vacuum line loose from the modulator valve and just drive it normally, it would slam shift every time it slammed because it thinks you're wide open throttle and it needs to hold the pressure. Because what the deal is, whenever you're picking up speed, how does an automatic transmission know when it's supposed to shift? The old days, they had a governor. The governor was hooked onto the drive shaft, the output. The faster it's flung, it has some little valves in here that were basically driven by centrifugal weights. Either the weights of the valve themselves or they have little things slinging out. Okay, and this is war stories. You wanted war stories, you're getting war stories. And this is transmission war stories. Okay, so it would sling these things out. Now, the old transmissions, like the old the 350 turbohydromatic, they had the little dome cover on the side of it. It was popped on there with a little wire clip. You pop that over, pull that off, and you pull the governor out. And on the bottom of the governor, there's a gear, right? and that gear was actually made as it slung those flyweights out, it moved a valve. Governor pressure would cause it to move some valves in the valve body and shift up to the next gear. Well, modulator pressure would push against that. So if it got to the speed when it would ordinarily shift, you've got this other pressure, which is your modulator. As the vacuum goes down, it pushes against governor pressure on the other side of that valve, and it's going to keep it from shifting. Eventually, governor pressure will overcome that and shift. You see what I'm saying? They work against each other. Now, some of them, like the Chrysler, would have a throttle valve. They didn't use vacuum. What they do is they'd run a link from your carburetor linkage down to the transmission, and it would move a little valve, and that little valve would act the same way as the modulator. And sometimes you'll see that if you ever pull the vacuum line off of a modulator and you see transmission oil there, you need to put a modulator valve on it because the diaphragm's compromised, right? Got a rubber diaphragm in it. And on that Bronco over there and some of the Fords that I worked on, the modulator, when you got a modulator out of the parts room, it had to have the same color stripe around it, and there was a little pin, you know, that actually interacted between the modulator valve and the valve that it moved in there, and that had to be the right length, and it's, you know, a lot of little nuances and stuff like that. The point is, if that diaphragm is breached enough, it can pull transmission fluid through the vacuum line all the way into the engine and go out in the exhaust, right? Well, that wasn't a problem with his. I mean, you could put a modulator valve on it, and that didn't do any good. So what do you suppose, in a lot of what I've been telling you, would be the reason why, as he drove it down the road, like from Enterprise to Dothan, he'd get about to Wicksburg, he'd start blowing transmission fluid, it would just miss transmission fluid all over the cars behind him. And the transmission would still be pulling and all that kind of stuff. What do you think's going on there?
Just misses it out?
Yeah. Where's the transmission cooler in most of them?
Up there in the grill.
Hmm?
You're talking about external transmission cooler?
No, and most of the ones that you see, like from that vintage, you're seeing they're in the radiator.
Yeah.
It's basically got a cooler in the radiator. And you know the lines you have to take loose when you're changing the radiator out? Some of them got an oil cooler on one side and a transmission cooler on the other side. And it's that water swimming around in there. Okay, so on that particular one, whenever the radiator gets old and a bunch of sludge and stuff crowds up in there and gets about half full of crud, it'll still cool the engine, but the transmission is not getting enough cooling. So what you do is you put an external cooler on it, or you replace the radiator, and you replace the modulator valve and change the fluid. Typically that takes care of that whole problem. But I mean, there's some things you got to do. Now, on this RE401 that I was talking about, this Nissan I started to tell you about, it came in here and it wouldn't pull. She said, we went over a railroad track and it quit pulling. Right after I came to work here. This was stripped out. Right? And so the guy says, well, we're going to go ahead and do this. And so I said, all right, you guys make the decision and see what you got to do. So they went ahead and rebuilt the transmission. They pulled it apart and they did all they needed to do to it. We got a new torque converter. Take care of that. We kind of fleshed out the lines and whatnot. And they drove it, and it drove up the road running perfect, and it came back and it wouldn't shift out of high gear. It was stuck in high gear. And so I says, did you guys do anything about flushing the radiator, I mean the transmission oil cooler? Because you know, as soon as these foulings left this stripped out turbine, they went straight to the transmission cooler and deposited themselves in there. And now you're picking up a few of them coming back in here. They're getting in the valve body, and your valve, because when it comes back from the transmission cooler, it goes into the pan, right? You think the filter would catch that, but it won't. You can get a transmission filter to put in an inline between the cooler and the transmission. It's got a magnet in it. It costs about $20-something. Pretty expensive. And you got to put it in the one coming from the cooler. One way or another, you're better off if that is stripped out. You're going to get rid of those, blow the cooler lines out, even if you're replacing the transmission, whatever you're doing, and either replace the radiator or put an external cooler on it. That takes care of that, right? You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so here we are looking at a situation where if you don't do your homework and think about things, you're going to have issues. Now, there was another one I was telling him about that we rebuilt the transmission in a Taurus. And them guys worked on it. This is an illustration too. The first time they pulled the transmission out of that Taurus, they never pulled the transmission out of a Taurus before. It took them about a day and a half to get the transmission out of it. they took it out, they tore it down, they worked on it, they put it all back together with clutches and seals and all this kind of stuff. They put it back in the car and it didn't work right. So they had to pull it back out. Anyway, they had to pull it back out about 3 or 4 times to get it right. Okay, so finally I got all the solenoids. It's got 3 shift solenoids and a pressure control solenoid. Now the pressure control solenoid, let me talk for a second about that. The pressure control solenoid is the thing that takes the place of the modulator and the throttle valve. Your throttle position sensor tells the engine controller where your throttle is, and it's looking at engine load from the map sensor and the mass airflow sensor, what all else, and it controls the pressure. You got me? It's also got a feedback so it'll know what the pressure is. Some of them have got pressure switches here and there so that it'll know what various parts of the valve body are pressurized and all that kind of stuff. You got to understand how all that worked. This particular one, when we replaced the pressure control solenoid and the 3 shift solenoids after having taken it apart several times and fought with it, that took care of everything that was wrong. So I was telling him, if you're doing a front wheel drive transmission, it's hard to pull out and put back in, and it's got electric solenoids in it, you better put those in there. It's going to run the bill up some, but you don't want to have to tear it back down on your time. See what I'm saying? Go ahead and put solenoids in there. There's a reason why the transmission shop charges $2,000 or $3,000 to do a transmission. I was talking to a transmission shop over there where I buy some of my parts over in Dothan, and I was telling him about some of the problems we had with it. And him and his transmission guy were talking to one another, and they said, that sounds like the one, that C4DE that we worked on in that little Ford, whatever it was, and we had to pull out about 10 times. They had to pull it out 10 times and go back into it. So what I'm saying is, you know, transmission works not for the faint-hearted, and you know, you can look at every little piece and measure every little part, and sometimes you'll have something as simple as a piston. It's got a crack around it that you won't see unless you pull on it or unless pressure's on it. You see what I'm saying? But the long and the short of that was every little thing that you can understand about the way the transmission works and how those valves move around and which shifts valves are what. Now, one of the things I want to show you guys when I get a chance here, and you're going to find them in the book. I want you to sniff around and find out. You may even see them in your interactive stuff here. You're going to have tables, and you're going to say in this gear, you know, in this gear range, you're going to have all of these particular clutches. They'll have your clutches across the top and your gear ranges here, and they're going to have little X's or something telling you which clutches are applied and which one is holding and all this kind of stuff in these gears. And if you've got one, like I had one that I worked on one time, and a couple more things I want to tell you about here. It was an AOD, and it would shift first, second, third. Now let's see, it would shift first, second, and then when it hit third, it would neutralize. You know what I mean? This wouldn't have anything in third. It had no third, it had no fourth. And the problem with that was there was 2 sets of splines in this one. There was the turbine, and then there was the one that goes all the way into the end of the converter that gives you your overdrive and your lockup. Okay, so your lockup and the overdrive happens inside the transmission, but the lockup happened because the front part of this was actually affixed to the housing on the converter, and that shaft, when it took place back in the back, when the right clutch was applied, you'd have a straight lockup from the engine all the way through to the drive shaft, and that was stripped out. So you could take that shaft and stick it down to the torque converter, and you shouldn't be able to turn it. It ought to be just solid. It ought to try to turn the torque converter, and it was just stripped out. So I had to put one of those torque converters. I had to put one of those in there. Now, another thing I wanted to tell you, and I'm going to show you this. You see, sometimes, well, right here, where does this go? This is the torque converter. Where's it go?
It goes into the transmission and the pump.
That's right, and this slot here turns your pump, right? Okay, so if you ever pull an engine out or a transmission out or something like that for whatever reason, like if you got to pull a transmission out, you got to put a rear main seal in the engine. And this transmission, this is an older vehicle. This is the seal around here, right? And the torque converter has been supported because it's bolted to the engine. Well, now you leave your transmission sitting over there while you're waiting for your parts. A lot of times it'll distort that seal. So you need to pull this torque converter out of there and make sure that that seal is okay. Might not be a bad idea, just go ahead and put one in it. But on the ones like you guys are working on over there, that front seal that goes around here, it's got a little sort of a cage thing that bites into the front of the pump you put on there, because if you don't put that back on there, the pressure that's behind that seal will blow that seal out of there every time. So what you got to do is you got to make sure you put that cage back on there and it's staked really good. the seal, and that's on the 4L60E like you're working on. That'll blow that seal out of there. It won't do that on any other transmission I know about it, but that 4L60E is bad to do that. And so that's the deal on that. However, I got another picture here I want to show you. If I can get past my fish. Because this guy, when I was at the Lincoln Mercury place in 1984, there was a guy that worked and worked and worked. Uh-oh, I messed that up. There was a guy that worked and worked and worked on that. And he had a torque converter that was leaking that he would have sworn was the front pump seal. Well, what do you see about this? That torque converter, that goes up in the back of the drive shaft, right? Or up in the, you know, where I'm talking about the flywheel. This is the flywheel end of that thing. See it leaking there? See it leaking? I'm in here doing a little talk here if you want to come in. But right here, where do you think that leak's coming from? We laid the torque converter up on the bench. Do you see any oil anywhere else?
It looks like it's coming out the end of the shaft and goes up in the motor.
It actually is. There's a crack there. Right? See that leak? Drive you nuts. You can't see anything except that there's fluid there. That's how fine that little crack is. All right? That's why it did that. Now what happens is sometimes that flywheel will crack like that, and the torque converter loses its support. But it'll still keep driving because that's a ragged sort of a crack. And what is another name for this part up here that you're looking at? What else do they call it? Got another name for it? Flex plate. Why do they call it a flex plate? What happens when the engine starts spinning this? What's that going into? That's going into the pump. What's the pump doing? Where's the first place the fluid goes when it leaves the pump? The very first place the fluid goes when it leaves the pump is in here. And it goes in there with a heck of a lot of pressure. Now you got a pressure control solenoid, and you've also got a pressure relief valve, which basically is going to keep it from going too high. But as thick as this is, and that is a thick piece of metal right there, in case you hadn't picked this thing up, that's pretty darn thick. I mean, it's thick and it's heavy. It swells the converter a little bit. And when it swells the converter a little bit, it flexes that plate. And as it flexes that plate, it winds up cracking flywheels. Every one of these is a cracked flywheel. There's you a cracked flywheel. Hand that one there to somebody else. That's a cracked flywheel. And that's a cracked flywheel. Every doggone one of these flywheels is cracked. And they were cracked because the torque converter continued to expand around where it's bolted to the crankshaft. And what you're going to hear before you do anything else is you're going to hear a click, 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 click noise that sounds like an engine noise that's up in the bell housing area. If you listen with a stethoscope into the bell housing area and you hear a clicking noise, this is what you're hunting. Now the one with the arrows on it, right over there, came out of a 2000 model Chevrolet pickup with a 6-liter in it. That's a Silverado. Jimmy Hutto drives it. It's his personal truck. The simple fact is, he was hearing a noise he thought was an engine noise, and it was a flywheel noise. So you can see them little cracks in there. This one here is an extreme case of it. But if it cracks the right way, even if it breaks completely out, you're going to have more. That's the truck right there. That's the black truck that it came out of. Now, another thing that happened, the center was busted out of that flywheel, but the center, when they took the bolts out, whoever took the bolts out, fooled around and left the doggone busted off piece of a flywheel up there, and then put the other flywheel up there on top of it. That caused some trouble too, you can imagine. So it had to come back out. But anyway, that's the one right there. I was going to show you about that. Okay.
That torque converter was bound up in it. I didn't realize it.
Yeah. Well, that's right. It did. I mean, that's what I'm saying. All right. So here's another one. Now this one right here is a different deal. There was my boy Jimmy was working on this one over at the Ford place. This is another war story. I know you guys love war stories. And there was a Lincoln that came in there, You know this overdrive cancel switch? The overdrive cancel switch on the end of the stalk? What does that do? What's that for?
When you pull in a trailer,
Huh?
you pull in a trailer, it cuts,
Oh, why do you, what exactly does it do when you push that button though?
disengage.
Takes their gear
Anybody know? I'm probably gonna hit you guys tomorrow with another one of these draw on the board and tell me things, so be paying attention. Okay, when you push that button, that light comes on, doesn't it? Does that button turn that light on?
Drop, drop.
No. The button actually sends a 12-volt signal to a particular pin on the engine controller. The engine controller receives that signal and then turns the light on. So you're not turning on the light when you mash the button. You're telling the engine controller to disengage fourth gear, which is your overdrive gear, right? So that you won't be overloading or you won't be in too bad. What happens if you're driving a car and you're in too high of a gear?
Burns up. And
Well, it just has trouble. You know, the engine's actually overstraining. It's not in its power curve. You want the engine to stay in its power curve, so you want to stay in a lower gear so you can pull the trailer better. That's basically what you don't want to put any undue strain on any components. Well, listen, he's got a Lincoln that turns on its own overdrive light. When you mash the stalk, the button on the end of the stalk on that Lincoln, it turns, like if you're in hilly country, like you're driving in mountains, you basically want to turn off overdrive so it's not hunting all the time, right? Okay, so you push that button, and but the Lincoln driver is not pushing the button, and the light's coming on by itself.
Is there a button line or PCM line?
Well, all right, the button's better than the PCM. Well, the button ain't being pushed, but the PCM. So Jimmy's checked everything he could, kind of like you're talking about, wire harnesses as far as he could tell and all that. And he's scratching his head, and he gets a PCM. Plugs it in there, drives it around. Before he's been driving it for 30 minutes, the light comes on again. Now, how much would you pay? Like the pitch man says, you know what I mean? We've already sold a PCM we didn't need. And we got the same problem we had. And this is not something that, you know, is going to escape notice. If they're driving and they look over at that overdrive light, all they had to push the button, it's back on you. You're never going to believe what he found. He's tracking the wire harness. See the wire schematic right here? See all that? There's your transmission control indicator lamp on that. Now you might notice this represents alternate current paths. It's like for an analog cluster or digital cluster. Powertrain control module. Okay, so this indicator lamp, okay, there's the switch here. Where's the switch? We're missing a switch somewhere. See a switch? Gotta find a wiring schematic with the switch. We see a switch here. Brake pressure switch. Vehicle speed sensor. That's not the switch we were looking for, is it? All right, you see the one that turns off the transmission control switch. There it is. All right. You see the transmission control switch, right? You see this connector number, C102F. See that? All right. I'll show you what he found. When he found C102F, it was down there by the wheel well. This is the connector that he had. See C102? See all of these wires going through C102. How many wires are in that connector? Somebody tell me really quick. Huh? 16 wires. Yeah, they're both. These are both the same connectors, male and female, they plug together. Okay, so the long and the short of it is, when you unplug this connector, and it's a weatherproof connector, it's got seals in it, right? So that to keep water out and splash, because it's actually exposed to the elements. It was full of something that looked like dirty water. Got it? All right. He says, man, that sure is some dirty water in that connector. But then when he got it on his hand, it was brake fluid. Okay, so how the heck did brake fluid, when that thing is this far from the master cylinder and nothing else in there is wet, how did he get brake fluid in that connector, which the brake fluid is causing a short between two of these terminals and causing that overdrive cancel light to come on?
Someone changed brakes before? Like,
No, I'll tell you what it is. Let me see if I can get here. See that switch right there? That switch right there screws right into the high pressure part of the brake. That is actually to cancel cruise control. It's one of your redundant cruise control cancellation devices. Those things right there tended to go bad and start leaking because how much pressure is in there? You can have a couple thousand pounds of pressure in there. This thing starts leaking, brake fluid goes in here, that's a sealed connector, and now that wire has become a piece of pipe and it's carried that brake fluid all the way through the insulation in that wire, all the way down into that connector, and over time, every time somebody mashed the brake, it would pump a little more brake fluid down there and that connector started to fill up. Now, I don't think you would come down too hard on that boy for putting a PCM on there, because who would have ever thought of something like that? He wasn't seeing it anywhere until he unplugged the connector, because he was thinking, well, the power and the overdrive cancel signal both go through the same connector on the way to the PCM, so perhaps we got an issue there. That's why he unplugged it and looked at it. You understand what I'm saying? All of this stuff goes together. We're talking about in brakes. This is brakes and transmission coming together, right? It's a crazy job. All right. War Story City. I don't know why I keep Xing out of that folder instead of just hitting back up. That's silly. All right. There we go.
Can that happen with any other connector?
Huh?
Can that happen with any other connector?
It can happen with any connector that's a sealed connector. It's weatherproof. It's got a seal around it. And you'll see the connectors with little rubber seals in them. That's made to keep water and everything out. And any connector that can have pressure in it, like some of the old GM cars used to have an engine coolant sensor that would begin to leak coolant through the sensor, and the sensor would push coolant over time up through that wire, and believe, where did that wire go? Where does the engine coolant temperature sensor wires go to the PCM? So they start having all kinds of crazy problems. You pull the PCM off and you're pouring antifreeze out of it. So if you've got a sealed connector going to wires that's got fluid behind it, and that connector can leak, believe it or not, that capillary attraction can pull that fluid all the way through that wire. You know, because water can, fluid can go somewhere other, places where nothing else can go. You get where I'm going. So that is something that can definitely happen. You don't see it a heck of a lot, but you better be prepared for it. All right. Now this is something else I want you to look at. This is a nice calculation thing, because Amber loves doing calculations on the computer. She's been working on one of those right here. Okay, we're going to calculate transmission slip speed for a P1870 code on a 4L60E. Calculate the input feed. If the vehicle speed sensor RPM is 2,000 per Tech 2 scan reading, you multiply that figure by the ratio of the gear being checked. You have to know what the ratio of the gear is, but you can pull that up. Assuming the overdrive ratio is 696, which is pretty much right for overdrive, multiplying that by 2,000 would give a proper engine input speed reading of 1392 if there's no slip. Subtract 1392 from the engine speed recorded to calculate the slip. If the engine speed is 1400, the slip speed RPM is 8. Everybody got that? Everybody want a copy of that handout? You may need it, right? The slip window the PCM is looking for on GM linear transmissions, linear means it runs front to back and it's got a drive shaft, it's 130 to 800 for 7 seconds. Anything greater than 800 RPM slip for 7 seconds will flag the P1870 code. This code keeps coming back, right? You got issues with that. Speaking of codes, my son Luke has a, who knows what a PO125 code means? You remember from last semester? PO125. That means that the engine's too cold for it to go into closed loop, right? Thermostat, right? Remember that code? Some of you dealt with it.
I don't memorize the codes though.
Huh?
I don't memorize the codes though.
No, PO128 means the thermostat's opening a little too soon. PO125 means it's opening way too soon. I don't memorize them all myself, because there's about 10,000 of them. But the long and the short of it is, what's a 700 series code? Like a PO7 what? Transmission. Got me? Anyway, the PO125 code, he put a thermostat in it. He says, it's still running too cold. It came on again and threw me another 125. So he puts another one in. He says it came on again. So he went and bought a thermostat from Toyota. And he's asking everybody he knows, it's a mechanic, include me. Well, you know where I found the answer for his problem? I went to Identifix. You know what Identifix said? If the oxygen heater, sensor heater is burned out, and the oxygen sensor is not switching because it can't get warm enough, it'll throw you a 125 code. Badly written software. it should have a code telling you the oxygen sensor heater is burned out. And that's what he found. See what I'm saying? All right, long and short of it is, all right, now we're going to talk a little bit about, this is a heavy duty